Hello there again, and welcome back to Animal Science, and this is Unit 8, Genetic Selection and Mating. We're going to take this unit to layer on top of the unit back in number 6, where we talked about reproduction, and then number 7, where we talked about genetics, and we're going to add how we utilize that genetic selection, those genetic knowledge, and mate them to make superior animals. Again, chapters 13 and 14 in your textbook, good 30 pages of recommended reading there. But let's dive into the material that I have here in the PowerPoint. We talk about continuous variation in many pairs of genes. When we talk about just the economically important traits, they're controlled by multiple gene pairs. So when we talk about the economically important genes, there's more than 100,000 genes in animals. That's an estimate now of what we would consider economically important genes. So that already should tell you, as we go through this unit, it's very difficult to select something and amplify it genetically through selection. It's very hard to do because of such random process. Let's look at an example here in the middle of the slide. There's 20 pairs of genes affecting yearling weight in sheep. So essentially that's 1 million different egg sperm combinations and 3.5 billion different genotypes just for yearling weight and sheep. So that tells you, if I have a goal of increasing yearling weight by, let's just say, 5 pounds on average in my herd, how difficult genetically that's going to be in order to have that outcome, and how many generations it may take to actually achieve that 5 pounds. And we'll look at a couple of mathematical equations here in a second. But remember, back to your meiotic division, 20 gene pairs, and we split those and all that meiotic divisions in both the egg and the sperm side, and now you see why we get to all those different genetic combinations. Producers often observe a lot of continuous variation genetically, and we can see large differences in performance. The other crazy thing that comes into play is what might be a superior genetic animal on one farm. You take the same genes and put them on a different farm, they perform completely differently under a different environment, different nutrition, and so on and so forth, which I have alluded to before. So it's very difficult sometimes to identify what is the best genetic animal or genetic. Here's a chart that your your author puts together here, kind of giving you the idea of structure and flow of genetics. So at the top of the pyramid, we have your elite seed stock producers. This would be potentially your breeders that are making the absolute best genetics out there. What happens then is your next purebred breeders, the green block there in the pyramid, that are your multiplier seed stock. So guys that are taking those high-end genetics and breeding their cows or their pigs or their sheep to those high-end genetics that the elite guys are using. Then it infiltrates its way down, let's say, into the commercial producer, i.e. the cow-calf guy. Finally, you get a few bulls that are available that you might buy your neighbor's bull that has great genetics and puts that on your farm. Or finally, they're available through the semen company and you're able to purchase that and put it on your farm. All the way down then to the commercial growing and feeding enterprises, and how that kind of trickles down. I'll give you an example. My brother happens to work right now on a very prominent operation in which they have some very high-end, high genetic and dairy animals, and are flushing animals to bulls that he's not allowed to talk about yet, because they want to make some babies and see what their genetic potential is before they would release that bull for commercial sale. So that would be an example of like an elite seed stock producer. Here's a chart that I like to talk about because it shows you some genetic information and production information in the difference or variance in weaning weight of beef cattle. So if we start at the middle, it's a traditional bell curve. Let's say we have 100 calves in our population, and the mean or average weaning weight on these calves is 440 pounds. That black line right in the middle that goes right to the peak of the bell curve. So the biggest bulk of your animals would weigh between 430 and 449 pounds. And then your next standard deviation would be one standard deviation each way. So between 410 and 469 pounds would be like your C students. Those would be your best, your biggest population there. So what we're looking at here is you have some calves in the population, let's say about 2 to 3, that are going to be down below that 349 pounds, that are way down there. for some reason genetically they're way behind, or performance-wise they're way behind, and for some reason you have 2 to 5 calves that are up there at that they're greater than 530 pounds. So we say, well, what should you be selecting for? This is a good conversation to have. What should you be selecting for to breed from? If these were 100 heifers on your operation, where do you pick your breeding stock from? That's a good conversation that we'll have in class, and I'll kind of leave you with that to think about, because I'm interested in what discussion that you'll come back to. There's not an easy answer to this, and there's a lot of discussion to come into it. So I'll be interested to see what you come back to class in discussion, because we'll slide and look at how many head there might be in that population, and then I believe to a subsequent slide later is we can add then maybe different breeds and crossbreeding genetics that may move that needle one way or the other. So it'll be interesting to have some discussion with you what you think about that bell curve. I'll be looking forward to that. When we look at trait advancement, there's 2 kind of categories of traits that we can consider. Number 1 is what we call quantitative traits, things that we can objectively measure. For example, skeletal size, how tall they are at the hips or the withers, what their speed is if we're talking about horses, for example. Things that we can observe that typically exist along a continuum, milk production, for example, average daily gain, that might exist, again, along a continuum from 0 to 100, so to speak. So those are quantitative traits, and certainly those are ones that we can clearly look at. The next category is what we call qualitative traits, ones that are very descriptive or subjectively measured. For example, hair color, horned versus polled, that kind of thing, where you may have one producer may prefer horned animals or don't care, and another producer puts a high value on polled animals, or one breeder prefers paint horses versus another one prefers solid colored horses. And how do you identify which one is actually better? That's where the quantitative aspect comes in. Here's the difficult thing. There's oftentimes many gene pairs that control the quantitative traits, and very few influence the qualitative traits. So that should tell you, I hope, statistically speaking, that it's very easy to affect a qualitative trait. It's very easy to select for that. It's very easy to select horned versus polled. It's very easy to select black versus red, versus it's very difficult to select for more milk production, or more fertility, or a higher health trait, or a little bit different back fat thickness, or different carcass merit trait. Those are very difficult to select for, because there's a lot of gene pair combinations, and it gets back to the first slide. Always remember, I talked about this in the genetics section. Doesn't matter, the phenotype and the genotype always affected by environment. We won't go back there and adjust and talk about that anymore. There's a lot of mating systems and formulas that are used, and I'm not going to test you on this particular example right here or any of these formulas, but there's always ways to adjust weaning weights for beef cattle. So you're comparing the calf born on the first day of the calving season and the calf born on the last day of the calving season, and comparing those equally, because your calf born on the first day of the calving season has a head start, but may not be the best genetic performer. The calf born on the last day of the calving season, even though it was always going to be probably one of the smaller ones at weaning time, might be actually genetically pretty good. So there's a way to standardize those so that you can compare apples to apples, so to speak. We do this in the dairy industry with milk production by standardizing milk records to 305 days in the lactation. That way, cows that made a record that lasted 365 days long and they made X amount of milk can be compared equally to cows that maybe only would have milked 300 days and made X amount of milk that was maybe less. So you can compare those equally and mathematically standardize that production. So hopefully we can predict some of those outcomes, and we can estimate then a concept that we call heritability, which is how easily is it to pass along. Heritability then comes into it as we say, well, how easy is it to pass that on? The portion of the selection differential that's passed from parent to offspring. So if it's easy to pass along, the heritability is very high. If it's very difficult to pass along, the percent heritability is relatively low. So for example, here's a swine producer that has an average post-weaning average daily gain of 1.8 pounds per day. He picks a group of females with a post-weaning ADG of 2.3 to breed from, and breeds them shooting for an increase of half a pound per day increase. Their offspring might only average 1.95. It might take a little while for them to get up to 2.3. You're not going to gain that much with one generation. It takes several generations. So here's a little bit of mathematics on how that works, and you can go through and see basically we have a 30% heritability. And if we put it into our chart here below, that is what we call a medium heritability trait. So it's okay, 30% chance that we'll pass that along. Things that have 40% or more or greater heritability are traits that are very, very easy to breed for, and I say very, very in a relative sense, are relatively easy to breed for. Traits that have low heritability, which would be less than 20%, are generally pretty difficult to have confidence that they will show up in the next generation. This gives you some examples here on heritability and how to express that, and this is continued on to the next slide, by the way. So we just pick a couple out there on beef cattle. For example, like weight at puberty is about 50% heritable. Scrotal circumference in bulls and beef cows, about 50% heritability, very high. So if you have a very sound scrotal circumference bull, his offspring is probably going to have the same thing. Birth weight's up there, body condition scores up there. Percent calf crop, very low heritability, only down there at 10%. So you guys can go through and kind of pick the species of your choice. Look at some of the key traits and find heritability numbers. And I will tell you, some of the purebred organizations are really looking at this data right here and figuring out what can we do to amplify the ones that we would select to be better, and how do we de-emphasize the importance of the traits that are really easy to select for. For example, if you look back in the beef cattle one, how do we select against birth weight without decreasing our calf size so much that we lose wean weight? There's some interesting interactions there that some of your purebred industries are looking at. So as we look at predicting genetic change and genetic interval, how quickly can we make a change per generation? Keep in mind the generation interval in swine is 2 years, and we have a litter 3 months, 3 weeks, 3 days. Have a litter 3 months, 3 weeks, 3 days. Have a litter. We can really move along, a little, almost 2 litters or about 2 litters a year. We can very quickly have new genetics back into our herd. Dairy, it takes a little bit longer at 3 to 4 years. Now, I will tell you, with some of the things that we're doing genetically in dairy, kind of tagging off of stuff that the swine folks have done and even beyond, is we're decreasing that generation interval faster and faster all the time. The beef guys are the longest ones out there at 5 to 6 years, partly because they're not using as much AI and not as much genetic sampling is going on there. So it takes a little bit of time. Remember, we don't have breeding females most of the time until about 2 years of age in dairy and beef cattle, and swine not obviously quite that long, but the average age of the parent when the offspring is born. So again, if we look at that, it takes, we can always expect half or maybe about a quarter change to the original amount that we were looking at per generation. Very difficult to make that change. Evidence of genetic change, again, if we look at our ability to produce dress weight turkeys, we can do it in about 5 months now. Used to take quite a lot longer than that. Again, so it's not just theoretical. We've done this quite nicely. In the last 50 years in dairy cows, we've increased average milk production by 11 to 15,000 pounds per cow, and just in the last 50 years. It's an unbelievable change in genetics and productivity. So there is evidence there. It can. Here comes some slides that shows you some of that. This would be genetic trends for 6 traits in beef cattle EPDs, from birth all the way down to stayability. I'll let you study that for a second, and you can always come back and review it in your notes. Notice we've done a pretty good job of holding down birth weights. that yearling weight is coming along quite nicely. Genetic improvement through AI, and we've talked about that already, so again, we won't belabor that point, but it's basically a close second to the environment managerial conditions in order to improve. That's what we'll say about that and move on to the selection methods. This is kind of an interesting concept to talk about, and we'll start with tandem selection. Essentially what we're going along here and doing is selecting one trait to improve at a time. So let's go back to our beef example, and let's say we want to improve our weaning weight, and that's what we're selecting for. We're going to select females and males in our herd that improve weaning weight, and that's the only thing we're going to worry about. All other traits are going to be pushed to the back burner. We're not even going to think about them, not even going to measure them. This is appropriate if we're going to make one rapid change on one trait quickly. Okay, this is appropriate. The problem is we may lose some genetic progress in other traits. And I'm not going to give that away, but think about that critically, and let's talk about that in discussion, where we may make great progress in selecting for weaning weight, but we might sacrifice some other things. So think about what that might be. Let's talk about discussion. The bottom point says typically this is not recommended, and I think when we talk in discussion you'll figure out why. Is because of loss in genetic progress in other traits, because we're only looking at one trait at a time and not looking at the entire genetic picture. Independent culling then is your next selection method, where we basically set some performance minimums or minimum culling levels for each trait in the selection program. So maybe let's take weaning weight, we add birth weight, and we add carcass merit, and we look at those three things. And then as all of our animals come through the program, we're measuring them to figure out which animals make the mark. And you have to make all three in order to stay in the breeding program. So a calf out of Bessie makes all three protocols. She gets to get bred again and stay in the herd. A calf out of another cow number B, her calf only makes two of the three protocols. Well, maybe you start thinking about maybe she doesn't need to be in the breeding herd anymore. Maybe you cull her. A calf out of cow C that only makes one of the three protocols, she's probably going to be removed from the breeding herd. And a calf out of cow D that doesn't make any, it would be unlikely that you would need to breed her. This is the second most effective selection method, but probably the most utilized across the board in all animal species. Not necessarily the best one now, but one the most used. The good part about independent culling is you have to collect some information. You have to at least set some goals and track them. So now at least you're getting into some data analysis and understanding that now you're having some good information to back up your decisions. The disadvantage is if you're following this like you should, sometimes you're going to call a genetically superior animal for marginal performance of a single trait. And we'll talk about why that is in class and discussion. But you may pull the trigger on getting rid of a really good animal that maybe you shouldn't. Or there will be occasions where you ignore the data because you really like the animal that shouldn't be in the breeding herd anymore. Genetically, she's not superior. So we'll talk about that in class and kind of the hang-up that goes with that. The last concept is what we call selection indices. Now we're putting value to multiple traits and an economic rating to each and every one of them. So we start to now rank individuals objectively along a continuum of traits. It's very difficult to develop. It takes a lot of time, a lot of data, a lot of analysis, a lot of measurement to see if we're tracking the correct traits and we're tracking them effectively and if our data is accurate and valid. So it does take quite a bit of time. The good part is once you have that data set and it is appropriate and it is effective and it is valid, it's a great measuring tool. The disadvantages is as things shift in economic value, sometimes traits shift over time. And if we fail to identify the defects or weaknesses in those traits, we can take a lot of time to get back changes. I'll tell you, there's a great one going on right now in the dairy business is frame size or wither height is a trait that we're really arguing about in the dairy business now. Some are arguing that our cows are way too big and that we've let stature impede and get in the way of really other very important economic traits. and now we're going to take generations to breed the excessive stature in some cows out, because the cows that we have in some farms today are too big for the stalls, they're too big for the parlors, they're too big for the feet that they have to walk on, so their feet and legs break down. We have all kinds of problems that maybe relate to that. And so it's taken us time to adjust the genetic index, the selection index, and now we have to select against it. Now we have to get the offspring to breed back to. So you can see we're talking about multiple generations down the road here, in which it may take us to breed stature, excessive stature, I guess, out of some of our dairy. So when we do basis for selection, whichever tool that you choose, hopefully you're picking heritable traits, things that are easy to measure, are associated with economic value, the genetic estimates are accurate, and there's genetic variation available to pick from. Okay, so there's a lot of things going on. And notice today your advanced breeders, your advanced producers are relying less on visual appraisal of animals, less of what they see, and more on selection tools and data, and that's probably a good. Basis for selection, here comes a couple of tools or things that you maybe weren't making the connection and now you will. EPDs are expected progeny differences. So here we set the average at 0. That would be the average of the breed. Let's say in weaning weights we set the average EPD at 0. And then animals that have weaning weights above the average of the herd, maybe they go +1. Average that animals that have they're 2 times better than the average are +2 on EPD. Stuff like that. I'm oversimplifying it a little bit, but it gives you an idea of how we begin to now use a selection index, an expected progeny difference. If we use bull A on cow B and make that mating, what would be an expected progeny outcome? Kind of relating back to the Punnett square that we practiced in the genetics section. Data that you get, the more accurate the analysis becomes. For example, back here to the basis for selection in the dairy industry, we've been collecting data through DHI since the late 1920s. So we have approaching 100 years of data, genetic data on cows across the country and even now across the world that we're putting into our genetic pool and measuring that data with. And so we're getting a very good idea of what traits are important and the gene interactions that we have going on. So it's evolving into and has evolved over time into testing progeny, whether they're males or females, and figuring out genetically what's available there in order to make ideal mating. Changes in milk production, I mentioned this earlier. You guys can review this on your own time. Again, I mentioned statistically herds on DHI have a clear production advantage on herds not in DHI. I think I'll show you a chart here in a second. I say, however, that's changing. And why? Because of automation. Because of data collection at the farm level, not necessarily data collection on the national. Here's a historic look at, if you go back to 1906, DHI herds had an average of 5,000 pounds of milk. Non-DHI herds about 3,600. Fast forward to about 1990, DHI herds tested their cows average about 18,000 pounds of milk. Non-DHI herds about 14,000 pounds of milk. So still quite a lot of advantage. Go all the way to 2007, still a 3,000 pound or now 2,500 pound advantage to a DHI herd, simply because they have more genetic data in which to make decisions from. Now, clearly it's 2017, the date that I'm recording this audio. Clearly that gap is closing because each herd now, if you choose to have the equipment and the computer software there available, you can have information on your own cows and your own herd, not necessarily comparing it to the nationwide stuff. So that gap continues to close a little bit more as we collect more and more data. So it's interesting to see what will happen, let's say, in the next 50 years on the dairy side. But the same concepts are occurring, same conversations are going on in pigs and beef cattle and so on. Mating systems, obviously we talked about the seed stock producers early on and the commercial breeders. Go back to that pyramid, so I won't spend a lot of time on this, but 3 critical decisions made by breeders, whether they're commercial or purebred, is which individuals are selected to become parents, the rate of reproduction from each individual, how many generations are they allowed to create, and then what's the most beneficial mating system. That's three big decisions that a breeder makes. Two main mating systems. You can either look at an inbreeding mating system where we're using animals with kind of very closely related parentage, or outbreeding systems where animals are not closely related to the average population. And there is usefulness in both systems, and we will, I'm sure, make jokes in class about inbreeding and so forth, but there is some really good ways to use kind of close inbreeding systems, or line breeding is what we call it, in order to really amplify some great genetics in a genetic line. So we have to understand parentage relationships in order to make effective matings, because clearly there's a little bit of risk to some bad stuff, but if we know our genetics. Here's a continuum going from self-fertilization like what corn would do, all the way to some line breeding here in the middle, one herd, one sire, or cousins, then to outcrossing, which would be completely genetic lines within the same breed though. Next would be crossbreeding, which would be, we're talking about the, crossing, crossing an Angus with a Hereford to get those blackface cattle. Then out to species crossing, which would be now outbreeding systems, which would be 100% heterozygosity. So somewhere in there you got to find the sweet spot, and oftentimes it needs to be done animal by animal, individual mating. Again, don't forget that we can't control the traits no matter which one that we do, inbreeding or outbreeding, intensive line breeding versus line breeding. So we want to make sure that we're careful how we're selecting that close genetic relationship and know that ancestral line and how. Intensive breeding, eventually if you continue to do it generation after generation after generation, you're probably going to lose genetic performance, more susceptible to some stressors, and we lose the advantage of heterosis. So at some point we got to outcross. And even though you're going to get really good uniform progeny, at some point you got to outcross somewhere in that genetic line in order to improve some heterosis and improve productivity. So think about your mating when you're on the inbreeding side of that. On the outbreeding side of the continuum, and especially when we talk about crossbreeding, and I'm going to ignore the species crosses thing here for the moment, because I don't think that's very, even though it's in your textbook, I don't think it's very applicable to some of the things that we're going to discuss in class. But two reasons for crossbreeding. We've talked about the heterosis, but you find neither breed is very superior in all things, but you can take the best things and complement each other, significantly increase. You can take advantage of that heterosis concept that we were talking about before. So hopefully we get a combination that results in the largest improvement. Now I asked the question at the bottom. We know already that outbreeding and crossbreeding is used very extensively in beef cattle, very extensively in swine, very extensively actually in turkeys. So why is it not infiltrated all the way into the dairy industry? And you find some producers in pockets, and we have some here in Clinton County that are doing it successfully, but why isn't it as sweeping a change in the dairy industry as it has in the other ones that we referenced? And I think you'll find that for whatever reason we can't find a mating that results in always, and I'm talking about always, a successful, genetically superior next generation animal. Where is that coming from? So for example, right now if you take the leader in terms of milk production, which is the Holstein breed, and cross it with the leader in terms of feed efficiency, but especially milk components, milk fat, milk protein, which is the Jersey, well, you're going to create a next generation animal that doesn't milk as much of the Holstein and doesn't have as much milk components as the Jersey. So we've lost in both cases. And I don't think they're going to be as feed efficient either. And then the next question becomes, with that smaller animal, that first generation, I call them Hojo crosses, what do you cross them to next? If you go back to a Jersey, then we get a smaller animal yet that has less milk production than the original Holstein, better components. If we cross it back to a Holstein, we get a larger framed animal, but we lose components. There's some talking about using brown Swiss. It's a long discussion about crossbreeding in the dairy industry. We can talk about that more in class, but we haven't found the right blend yet, is what I'm saying. So when we talk outcrossing here, and I apologize for the pause there, I had to clear my throat, but again, it's unrelated animals in the same breed when we talk about mating. Very useful if we have some act. Here we have an example diagram of a two-breed rotational cross where we have breed A sires and breed B sires. Here's that classic example of a Angus crossed with a Hereford, where we take those replacement females that would maybe be breed A Angus and we breed them to a Hereford bull. And we take those Hereford daughters and we breed them to an Angus bull, and so on and so forth. And we just keep crossing and have then hopefully. Here's a three-breed rotational cross. I was mentioning the Holstein Jersey Brown Swiss combination that there's some people playing with. There's some pig crossing systems that fit into this three-breed rotational. A two-breed rotational with a terminal sire cross, that would be breed C. And essentially what's going on here is all of the offspring out of breed C, the terminal sire cross, all of those are market animals. So you select only for meat production in the terminal sire cross. None of those are going to be bred. So in terms of, you're never going to select for any female production trait. It's going to be only related to meat production on the terminal sire cross. A little bit on grading up here and the outbreeding continuous use. If you have a grade herd and you want to become a purebred herd, by about the fourth generation you can reach basically purebred. Here's a scale, and we're basically starting on the right side and working left. Here we have grade C females and cross it with a purebred sire. Now we're at half and half identified. Cross them again, purebred sire, and all the way by the fifth generation. Now we have a 15/16 or a purebred animal, and in most herd books now you have an animal that you can. New lines or breeds, composite or synthetic breeds, as they're also known, like Brangus or Beefmaster or Santa Gertrudis. Basically, you're crossing those animals continuously enough that now we've essentially made a purebred line that you can then identify as purebred, like the three that we've listed here, like hybrid boars that we've used to set extensively in swine production. So that is certainly happen out there as well. Lastly, then, your take-home messages. Boy, you all know, I'm sure, people that have really mastered the art of making the right mating decisions. That's hard to do. It's very, very difficult. And I know I have people that I respect in the industry that I just think are great at making awesome mating decisions, and it doesn't seem to matter what type of animals they have in their barn or on their farm. They're just really good at making the next generation better and the next generation better, and on an individual basis they're really good at that. That's an art. It's not something that everybody does well, and so I can't stress enough to you. Think about that. Even if you're a commercial producer, advance the genetic base of your herd. Understand the different roles of each industry, seed stock versus commercial breeders. You know, we as purebred breeders, and I am one. My genetics aren't marketable if they aren't desired by the commercial livestock operator. That's important for us as purebred breeders to recognize. That if there's no market for us to sell our genetics to, our genetics are worthless. And so keep that in mind. Number two, on the flip side of that coin, the commercial producer needs to be aware of and appreciate the genetic advancement from the seed stock guys, because it's going to benefit them. So whether you're an operator or, again, a consultant, a semen rep, or whatever it might be, understand that the seed stock people are serving a great and vital role in providing genetics. Those commercial guys should hopefully are paying attention to what we have available, and hopefully we're making the right stuff for them. So this genetic stuff and selection and mating continues to be, and will continue to be for generations to come, not easy to do because of the variation that's out there on the farm, because of the different environmental conditions, the different preferences by consumer, by producer. So it'll continue to be an art to make great genetic selections. So I'll look forward to some really rigorous discussion in class, and I appreciate you listening over the last half hour to this unit.